Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we continue our study of Divrei Hayamim Bet, that is the book of Chronicles, the second book of Chronicles. We are about to begin chapter 21, an unfortunate chapter in the history of the nation of Judah. And we had just read the story of the life of Yehoshaphat, which was 95% positive and 5% negative. And his father Asa, who was also much more significantly positive, both of whom moved the needle in the right direction back towards God, towards the worship of God and abolishing idol worship from the land. However, the king we're going to read about today, Yehoram, brought it a full 180 backwards. So, Vayishkav Yehoshaphat im avotav. Yehoshaphat laid to rest with his fathers. He passed on. Vayikaver im avosav be'ir David, and he was buried with his fathers in the city of David. Vayimloch Yehoram beno tachtav, and his son Yehoram became king in his stead. So now we have a new king named Yehoram. Not to be confused with the Yehoram who was a king of the northern kingdom of Israel. This is Yehoram from the southern kingdom of Judah. If you remember, and when we studied Yehoshaphat's life, the big criticism of him, there was two. Despite the fact that for the most part he was a righteous king, he did not completely destroy the bamot, the alternate places of worship that on the high places where people generally worshipped God, but still not in the designated temple. And he made and forged an alliance with the northern kingdom, an alliance through marriage and a political alliance. They fought at least one big major battle that we read about together. And that alliance brought the influence of the northern kingdom, specifically the house of Achav, who was particularly evil in a corrupt way, in a murderous way. We know they murdered the prophets of Israel. They murdered whoever they saw as a potential threat, and they stole people's property and had innocent people killed. We read about this in the book of Kings, which concentrated much more on the northern kingdom of Israel. But now in the southern kingdom of Judah has an alliance through marriage, and of course, I neglected to mention the significant influence of idol worship and Baal worship in the spiritual practices of the northern kingdom, which was an especially corrupting experience. So now we have the king Yehoram, who is now the king of Yehuda, and let's learn about his unfortunate career. V'lo achim, he had brothers, bnei Yehoshaphat, who were other sons of Yehoshaphat. These brothers, interestingly, are not really talked about in the book of Kings. The Yehoram story we're about to read today is much more detailed than the story we read about in the book of Kings. The book of Kings pretty much says Yehoram became king, he was not a good guy, and he died, is essentially what's there. But here we'll have a lot more detail of what he did that made him into not such a good guy, to put it mildly. So his brothers were as follows: Azariah, Vichiel, Uzecharyahu, Va'azaryahu, Umichael, Ushvatyahu. So that is 6 brothers. Kol Ele b'nei Yehoshaphat Melech Yisrael. All of these were the sons of Yehoshaphat, the king of Israel. Here, and not for the first time, the kingdom of Yehuda is being called the king of Israel, because especially in the book of Chronicles we find this, because the focus is really only on Malchus Yehuda and the southern kingdom, which was the predecessor to the Jewish people who came to settle the land again in the Second Temple period and tried to rebuild it. The kingdom of Yehuda is the kingdom that to this day is looked at as the one that we succeed and the one that we are continuing its legacy. So Vayitein lahem avihem matanos rabos, their father, he foresaw the potential for conflict, and in order to prepare for it, he made sure to make all of his sons happy by giving them belongings, by giving them presents, many of them, many gold and silver, a lot of gold and silver, and many gifts. He also gave them, governorships or what would be similar to lordships over certain fortified cities within Yehuda. So all of the sons had respectable positions. And so that the political alliances and the political borders would be understood. Each one would have a place, would have a role, and would have a respectable position in order to prevent fighting down the road. But to be the king over all, that Nasan Yehoram, he gave to Yehoram, Ki hu ha-bechor, because he was the firstborn. There may be a little bit of criticism here when it says Ki hu ha-bechor, for he was the firstborn. Because it doesn't say because he was the one most worthy of ruling, or he was the most righteous, or he was, which as we will see is certainly the case. He was by far not the most righteous. Vayakam Yehoram ha-mamleches aviv. So Yehoram became established over the kingdom of his father. Vayischazek, and he strengthened himself. In other words, he ruled with an iron fist. Vayaharog et kol achav bechorev, and he had all of his brothers executed by the sword. Gam v'gam misari Yisrael, and also some of the other leaders and officers of Israel who he deemed not loyal enough to him, he had them killed. This is a very bad start and for a very bad career. So Yehoram began by committing terrible fratricide and killing all of his brothers. Ben Shloshim Ushtayim Shana Yehoram b'malcho. He was 32 years old when he became king. Ushmona Shanim Malach b'Yerushalayim, and his reign lasted an entire 8 years. Vayelech b'derech malchei Yisrael, and he went in the ways of the kings of Israel, which at the time was still the house of Achav. Right, Achav himself had passed, but his son had taken over. So Kasher asu beit Achav, they did just as the house of Achav had done. Ki bat Achav hayta lo liisha, because he had been married to the daughter of Achav. Vayas hara be'enei Adonai, and he did evil in the eyes of God. So this method of ruling with an iron fist, committing fratricide, and as we shall see in a minute, worshiping idols, this was something that he learned from the influence of the northern kingdom, which came through his marriage to a daughter of Achav, and her influence on him, and the influence of the northern kingdom in general on him and his behavior. But God did not want to, and he held himself back from destroying the house of David, despite the fact that the evil had reached a level where destroying the house of David and destroying the southern kingdom would have been warranted. That's the inference of this verse from verse 7. But God did not want to destroy it. Leman habris, because of the covenant asher karas leDavid, that he had made with David. Now, every covenant has a flip side, right? If you behave, then everything will be fine. If you don't behave, then it will be, God will punish you, and this will be over. You'll have broken the covenant. This covenant here, God says he did not want, we didn't quote God here, but God did not want to destroy the house of David. He had made a promise to David. He wanted to keep his end of the bargain. He had a hope, maybe, I know this is a lot of anthropomorphizing, making God sound like a human being, but excuse the way I'm speaking for a moment. I'm just reading this verse here. But basically, God felt that there's still, maybe that they can turn around. I don't want to break the covenant. I want the house of David to continue. Because God had said that he was going to give him a near. Near here is translated by most of the commentaries and translators to be a flame, like a flame as in a constant flame, to give him a flame, a fire that burns. for him and for his descendants for all days. So God held back his wrath from Yehoram despite the terrible behavior on Yehoram's part, and he did that because he wanted to keep his promise to David. So, and in typical fashion for the chronicler, there's a tit for tat that's very obvious in Divrei Hayamim. You behave, everything is good and there's quiet. Just like we learned with Asa and Yoshaphat, they were loyal to God, they had quiet. You don't behave, you're not loyal to God, you're not going to have political quiet. You're going to have wars and things are going to go badly for you. It's a very straightforward and tit for tat view of what later rabbis would call midah keneged midah, this for that. The punishment fits the crime, etc. So, biyam of Pasha Edom, and therefore in his days, in the time of Yehoram, during his reign, the people of Edom rebelled. We had learned that Edom, the residents of Har Seir, had been conquered by David back a couple generations ago, and they were under the thumb and they were paying tribute to Judah, to the king of Judah. And we learned some of them at least attempted a rebellion of sorts during the reign of Yehoshaphat, which we just read about in the last chapter, but they were unsuccessful, as we read about the miraculous victory. So Edom was constantly agitating, but still under the thumb of Yehuda, under Yehuda's rule. But during his days, they rebelled mitachas yad Yehuda. They escaped and they rebelled and won their independence from Yehuda, from Judah, vayamlichu aleim melech, and they appointed their own king, which means that until this point, Edom did not have their own king because they were a vassal state. There must have been some sort of governor loyal to Judah that was in charge of Edom. Whatever that setup was, it was over during Yehoram's day because Edom successfully rebelled. Vayavor, and now it tells a little bit of the story of that revolt. Vayavor Yehoram im Sorav, and Yehoram went with his officers, v'chol harechav imo, and all of his riders and his chariots. Vayehi kom laila, and he came during the night. Vayachas Edom asovei elav, and he attacked the camp of Edom, which had surrounded him. So he had seemingly good tactics, v'esari harechav, and he attacked the chariot commanders, or it could mean, and his chariot commanders accompanied him in the fight, but it really means here he attacked the Edomite command at night. So he attempted a war. However, it was unsuccessful, as we'll see in a moment. Vayivsha Edom mitachas yad Yehuda ad hayom hazeh. However, the battle was unsuccessful, and Edom remained independent, and they had and their rebellion against Yehuda lasts until this day. In other words, Judah never regained its hegemony over Edom. Oz tifsha livna ba'esahi mitachas yado, and Livna, also another region which was under the command of Yehuda, also rebelled and escaped his command. So Yehoram's kingdom is falling apart. This big kingdom that they used to have is falling apart, and the not so implicit message is that you misbehave, you act in a cruel manner, you act unfaithful to God, and you will be punished. Your kingdom will fall apart. Ki azava es Adonai Elohei abosav, because he had forsaken God, the Lord of his fathers. Gam hu asa bamot barei Yehuda, even worse than we said before. Yehoshaphat and Asa, who were loyal to God, didn't destroy Bamot. They didn't destroy the extraneous places of worship outside the temple, but he one-upped them. He didn't only not destroy them, but he built more in the mountains of Yehuda. Vayezen es Yoshvei Yerushalayim, and he turned the people. Vayezen here comes from the word liznot, which is from the word of zinut, of promiscuity, of being unfaithful, as in being unfaithful to one's spouse. Here he was being unfaithful in a similar way, and we find this comparison of the relationship between the people of Israel and God, often compared to the relationship between a man and his lover. So he led them astray, led them away from God. Vayadach et Yehuda, and he pushed Yehuda off the wrong path. He pushed them away. Vayadach is to push or to lead others along the wrong path. Vayavoy love michtav me'Eliyahu hanavi lemar. This is verse 12. And a letter arrived to him from Elijah the prophet. This is the only mention of Eliyahu hanavi in the book of Chronicles. Eliyahu hanavi, Elijah the prophet, who was a very prominent figure in the book of Kings during this time period of history. But for those that study the book of Kings with us, or those that are familiar with the book of Kings, they know that Eliyahu's work was all done with the northern kingdom of Israel, pretty much. His interaction with the kingdom of Yehuda was minor. But since the book of Chronicles only really chronicles the events of the kingdom of Yehuda, other than a couple of side references where they interacted with the northern kingdom, as we've seen a little bit here and there, like the mention of the marriage to Achav's daughter and so on. So we don't have a lot of Eliyahu Hanavi in the book of Chronicles. This is the only mention of him. But here we have Eliyahu Hanavi writes a letter to Yehoram, and Yehoram receives this letter, and within this letter it says as follows: so says God, the Lord of David, your ancestor, because you have not went on the path of Yehoshaphat your father and Asa your grandfather, the king of Yehuda. Instead you chose to go on the path of the kings of Israel. Vatazne, again this language of zunut, the language of unfaithfulness. You turned away Yehuda. You made the people of Judah turn away from God. That's Yoshvei Yerushalayim, and the residents of Jerusalem, kehaznot beit Achav, in the same way that the house of Achav up in the north turned away from their God. And even worse, this disloyalty to God led you to commit such horrific cruelty and killed all of your brothers, that those who were better than you. And this confirms that which I stated in the beginning of our lecture today, of our studying today, that the other brothers would have been better candidates as king, and choosing Yehoram just because he was the oldest was not the best idea. Here Eliyahu the prophet Elijah is confirming that indeed those brothers were better than you, and they would have been more worthy of being kings, but you killed them. Imagine had Yehoshaphat chosen one of the proper sons to be king, how history may have been different, but that's not what happened. What's going to happen? God is going to strike a tremendous suffering upon a tremendous magefa. Is usually refers to a plague, but it could mean any kind of terror, any kind of calamity. Right, ba'amecha, in your nation, uvivonecha, and in your sons, uvinashecha, and your daughters, uvachol ruchushecha, and in all of your possessions, all of your property. V'yata, and you yourself, b'chalayim rabim b'machalei me'echa, you are going to suffer from terrible illnesses. The illnesses will infect your stomach and make your intestines sick. Ad yetz'u me'echa min achol yamim ha'yamim, your intestines will pour out of your bowels. It's a really grotesque and disgusting illness. Whatever this illness was, it was horrific suffering. But more importantly, even than the suffering, which was awful, but it was also extraordinarily embarrassing and shameful to the king to suffer such a horrible illness, forcing him to not appear in public. Vayar Adonai al Yehoram es ruach haplishtim. So that was the end of the letter. So then this verse 16 is the fulfillment of that curse that Eliyahu repeated about Yehoram. And God awakened a ruach haplishtim, the spirit of the Philistines, v'ho arvim, and the Arabs, asher al yad kushim, who lived near the Cushites. So these are enemies. The Philistine enemies haven't been enemies now for generations. They had been subdued since the days of David. How many? 6-7 generations ago. We're talking many years. the Philistines had been peacefully subdued. I mean, they weren't subdued peacefully, but they weren't enemies. But God whipped up a spirit of rebellion amongst the Philistines. Presumably, they're following the others who used to be under the kingdom of Yehuda, which under Shlomo had reached its height of might and power, ruling over many nations around them. We learned of the loss of Libnah, we learned of the loss of Edom, and now the Philistines and the Arab tribes that had come from the south, living near the Cushites, living near the Cush, which is somewhere in modern day Sudan, southern Egypt, Ethiopia, that area. All of these people that were under the fist and rule of Yehuda started to rebel. Vayalu v'Yehuda v'Yevkoua, and they attacked the nation of Yehuda, and they broke through the defensive line and the walls. Vayishbu et kol ha'rechush hanimtzu leBeit HaMelech. They looted the city and stole all of the king's treasures and properties. V'gam bonov v'nashav, and they stole, either enslaved or killed his sons and his wives. V'lo nishar lo bein. Not a single one of his children remained, ki im Yehoachaz keton banav, other than one small child, Yehoachaz, his son. V'acharei kol zos, and after that, so here you have the curse of Eliyahu coming true, and then afterwards, nigafo Adonai b'me'av, God struck him in his bowels, l'chali v'lein marpeh, with the terrible illness that had no cure. Vayili amim miyamim, and then it was a bit later, a few years later, ucheis tzeisa ketz liyamim shnayim, when a full 2 years had passed from the time of the curse of Eliyahu, and then this terrible attack came that destroyed his household. Yatzu me'abim chalyo, his bowels came pouring out of him because of his illness. Vayamas b'tachalu imraim, and he died in terrible pain, in terrible suffering. V'lo asulo amos sreifa k'sreifas avosav. They did not make for him a sereifa. A sereifa means a burning or a fire, which was done in honor of the king. Presumably, they would burn many of his belongings. It was done in honor of the king as part of his funeral and as part and in his honor. But because he was such an unrespected king and such an unloved king, they didn't do this for him because nobody liked him. Everyone hated him. Ben shloshim ushtayim haya b'mocho. He was 32 years when he became king. Ushmona shanim malach b'Yerushalayim, and he ruled in Jerusalem for 8 years. Vayelech below chemda, and he left without any love. No one cared about Yehoram. Nobody liked him. Nobody cared about him. When you rule with strength, when you rule with an iron fist, and you rule by cutting down literally your enemies, when you rule with vengeance, when that's how you gain and stay in power, then even those people that stay next to you aren't there because they love you, because they care and admire you. They're there because they're afraid of you. There's no love lost at all when he passed away. These words, Vayelech below chemda, are quite instructive. He left without any love. If that's the way you live your life, then when you go, nobody cares. Vayikberu be'ir David, and they buried him in the city of David, v'lo b'kivrot hamelachim, but not in the burial places of the kings. This contradicts a little bit with the book of Kings, where it states that he was buried with his fathers, with the kings of David. So maybe there's you can try to be medayek, try to analyze these words a little carefully. Maybe they buried him in the same area, but not exactly in the same respectable kingly graves as his father Yoshaphat, his grandfather Asa, and his other forefathers, and so on. So this concludes chapter 21, which really ends the career of Yehoram, a king who was very unpopular, led the people down the wrong path of idol worship, and the destruction and the evil and the idol worship and the corruption that he began is not going to go away very fast. So we're going to learn about Yehoachaz and his rule, also known as Achazyahu, the same person, in the next chapter, as the kingdom of Yehuda continues its march through the march of history. Thank you so much for studying together with me. I really appreciate you joining me in the study of the book of Chronicles. Looking forward to studying the book of Chronicles, the entire book, chapter 22, and the rest of the book together. I wish everyone a wonderful day.